Hi there and welcome back to the channel. Today I want to discuss the victory of Donald Trump in the US presidential elections and specifically what it means for Portugal. Is it going to be good or bad? Okay, so first of all, this is not going to be a political video in the sense of I like Donald Trump or I dislike Donald Trump. I don't want to do that. I know that he is a very polarizing figure. I think that's fair to say, and that's something that I think people on both sides of the political spectrum would admit, that there are people who love him and there are people who hate him. You know, I do have my own opinion. I might share it in a future video. As most people know, I am quite a right-wing kind of person, but I also care very much about the personality and moral quality of a person. So consequently, it's a little bit difficult for me to pronounce myself either for or against Donald Trump. So I'm just going to avoid that, and I'm going to focus on specifically whether I think Donald Trump's impact on Portugal is going to be positive or negative, and try to break down different categories of impact. Firstly, I think Donald Trump's election victory is going to set off somewhat of an exodus from the US. And these would be basically, you can call them disgruntled Democratic voters, people who do not want to have Donald Trump as their president, don't want to stay in the US while he's president, between the 20th of January 2025 and the 20th of January 2029. Maybe they want to be out of the US. I don't know. Certainly on Google search trends, there has been a huge surge in how to leave the US, go and live in Portugal, things like that. And I just read an article in the Portugal Resident about that today. I do feel that during the previous Trump administration, there was a higher level of people emigrating from the United States and coming to make Europe or other places their home. Probably partially motivated by their political leanings, but of course not completely. Now, Portugal is of course one of the major destinations that Americans would consider as a possible place to retire or live. And I think that more left-leaning Americans, people from New York and California, for example, might choose to come to Portugal, not just for the weather, obviously, but because Portugal is a more left-leaning country. Perhaps they feel more comfortable here, and also because, generally speaking, people who tend to be on the left of the political spectrum are those who are more likely to move overseas and feel more comfortable learning another language, accepting another culture, that kind of thing. I think it's fair to say that compared to people on the right of the political spectrum, people on the left are more likely to emigrate. So I do anticipate that we will see somewhat of a surge of people leaving the US over the next few months and into 2025. And in terms of what that means for Portugal, I think obviously most people are going to come here and they're going to rent or buy a property. And that will probably have a favourable impact on property prices. Namely, it will send them up, especially in those parts of Portugal that are most favoured by Americans, such as Lisbon, Porto and Madeira. Now, obviously, some Portuguese people might not take the opinion that an increase in property prices or rents going up is a positive thing, and I can totally accept that. But generally, when a country becomes richer because the value of the assets in the country increases, we would normally think of that as a positive thing, and that is what I will foresee happening in this instance as more Americans come to Portugal. There are only about 14,000 resident Americans in Portugal right now, according to 2023 IMA data, and I wouldn't be shocked if that increased by 50% or even doubled. Next up, Donald Trump has a lot of economic policies which are very business focused. Things like trying to reshore American manufacturing, offering lower corporate tax rates to businesses that do their manufacturing in the US, and various other policies aimed at things like deregulation. Basically, and we've already seen this reaction in the markets, I would expect Donald Trump's economic policies to strengthen the US dollar. I expect the USD to strengthen by 5 to 10% approximately against the euro. Of course, I could be wrong, but that is what I foresee. I definitely don't think that the euro is going to go up in value against the US dollar. Now, what does that mean? It means it could be better for European companies that are exporting to the US market, that are selling their products there, although there are other things to consider in terms of tariffs, which we will come to later. But for Portugal, as a tourist destination that isn't a major exporter of things to the US, basically I think you're going to see more American tourists coming to Portugal because the dollar is stronger and their dollar will go further. So more American tourists, and the impact of that will be felt in the tourism and hospitality industries in Portugal, places like restaurants and hotels, people who are doing Airbnb, and primarily focused in the tourist areas of the country, although of course there will be some trickle-down effect to other areas of the country. And I think that that is a beneficial thing for employment and also for tax revenue. Another positive is that I think that Donald Trump in the White House is probably a good thing for freedom of speech in Europe. You know, we've seen somewhat of an assault on freedom of speech, like all these ideas of hate speech and people being censored online by media giants like Google and Facebook and X or Twitter or whatever you want to call it. Well, now Elon Musk is obviously running X, which is one of the big social networks, and he's very close to Trump as well. He's going to be a senior advisor in the administration. We don't know exactly what kind of role he's going to get. I think that we're going to see the EU be more cautious in implementation of policies which are negative to the American tech sector, and that could also go for companies like Apple. But if we just focus on freedom of speech for a moment, I don't think that we're going to see the EU put so much pressure on these social media giants to censor content, etc., as they have in the past, because to my mind, Elon Musk is going to complain about that to Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is going to see that as an attack by the EU on the social media companies, because on US social media companies, basically, an anti-competitive measure, essentially. I think that that will probably influence the EU authorities to be a little bit gentler in their treatment of this issue, and probably that will result in more freedom of speech for European citizens, because really I think that European citizens should have complete freedom to write almost anything they want online, and the line has definitely been crossed from talking about things like inciting violence and stuff, which is clearly wrong, to just anything which makes people feel offended now is potentially going to fall afoul of regulations. So I do support more freedom of speech, and I think that Musk and Trump are probably going to drive that agenda forward, and it will have a positive influence even in the European Union, just because of the dominance of American technology and social media companies in the space. Next, let's talk about trade wars. Now, this is really the hallmark policy of Donald Trump. He's always talking about tariffs. He's going to put tariffs on this and tariffs on that. He's going to punish these people. A lot of it is just talk. You know, based on the last administration, there wasn't so much action as there was talk. But definitely Trump will talk tough with the EU on trade policy. And there are lots of areas, including some major products like cars. And Germany obviously has a massive automotive industry. And also things like aeronautics. We have the Boeing Airbus competition. If you've been following the news in the US over the last 5 years, Boeing has been having an incredibly tough time. They've had a lot of problems with accidents. It's really driven down morale at the company as well as sales. And Boeing is a major employer in the US, and I'm sure that Donald Trump will want to try to resuscitate its fortunes on the global stage. And, competition with Airbus, making Airbus less competitive, is probably going to be one of his trade priorities, because aviation is big business. It brings in tens to hundreds of billions of dollars per year to economies. And I'm sure that Donald Trump wants more of that for the US, and no one can really blame him. Airbus is a consortium based in France, but it receives a lot of support from EU countries, and we can call that questionable. And I'm sure that Donald Trump is going to really leverage that as much as he possibly can to come to some kind of new trade agreement with the EU. I don't think his objective is to really have a trade war. His objective is to get more things made in America and to let American businesses make more profits, because that will make his country more economically prosperous. However, of course, the trade-off of that is that our other areas of the world will probably become less economically prosperous, and Europe could be one of those areas. Personally speaking, I don't think that the European Union is going to be tremendously good or strong when negotiating with Donald Trump, simply because he is coming from a position of greater strength. The US economy is bigger than the European one, and the European decision-making process is so fragmented, and we have outliers, people like Viktor Orban, etc., who have very, very divergent opinions. I think it's going to be a little bit difficult for the EU to get a good deal. So what does this mean? If we see trade tariffs or some kind of unfavorable trade deal, then it's going to lead to lower economic growth in the EU, especially in those countries that are doing manufacturing. Based on the examples we talked about, primarily the German car industry and the aviation industry in France with Airbus, but it will extend to other sectors as well, no doubt. That probably will lead to lower interest rates across the EU to try to stimulate growth. And Portugal, being a country that has a high debt burden, both in terms of the national government's debt burden, but also in terms of consumer debt, I think that that could be positive for Portuguese people. If you're a highly indebted society and interest rates go down, then it gives you more buffer, it gives you more money to spend, and it could be good. Southern Europe generally benefits from a lower interest rate environment, and I think Portugal is definitely in the group of countries that stands to enjoy some advantages as interest rates fall. The Trump administration and their policies will only propel them to fall even more rapidly. Lastly, for the positives for Portugal, I think that it's very, very likely that we see the Ukraine war end. Donald Trump has already said he could end it in one day. We know he has a tendency to be rather hyperbolic about these kind of things, but I definitely believe that he wants to see this conflict end. He doesn't want it to continue, and he certainly doesn't want to pay for it. I think that's the main thing for him. He doesn't want to pay for it, and I completely understand that. So if the Ukraine war ends, then I think that that is a good thing for Portugal. Of course, how it ends matters. But if it ends with some kind of peace treaty which is probably more favourable to Russia, and we see measures put in place like Ukraine doesn't join the EU for X number of years and doesn't join NATO and that kind of thing, then I think that's good for Portugal. As I mentioned in a previous video, Ukraine joining the EU would be a mistake, and it would see a massive reallocation of European funds from countries like Portugal and Poland and Bulgaria, who right now are at the lower levels of EU income, and almost all of that money would then be directed into the reconstruction of Ukraine. And I think Portugal would definitely suffer from that, because in Portugal we do receive quite a lot of EU funding, and to see that diminished to a very low level obviously wouldn't be beneficial. Beyond that, depending on how the war ends, you might see more exodus of Ukrainians from Ukraine, depending on the nature of the settlement. That could be good for some European countries, because I do think that Ukrainian refugees are more towards the right kind of migrants that we want to have in the EU. I think that they integrate well. And I think that they're quite a hard-working people. So I don't have an immense problem with more Ukrainians coming to the EU. Certainly it can help Portugal demographically, and it can also build up the tax base. So that's something potentially positive for Portugal, although profoundly negative for Ukraine. Lastly, if there is a peace settlement with Russia, then there is the potentiality that the EU can go back to buying gas and oil from Russia again, and this can lower energy costs. At the moment, the EU is very focused on green, renewable energy and on importing oil and natural gas from abroad. They're importing a lot of LNG from the US, which is much, much more expensive than Russian gas, which came in through pipelines. So that has led to the increase in fuel prices and energy prices for EU consumers and also for EU businesses. It's made the continent less competitive commercially, and it has also led to or contributed to a cost of living crisis in many countries. If that was to go into reverse, then obviously Portugal would benefit from that, just like every other EU member state would. So now let's talk about a couple of potentially negative things for Portugal. One big negative that I see is that as the dollar gets stronger and the US economy gets stronger and we potentially see trade barriers erected, it's probably going to lead the value of the euro to fall. As I mentioned earlier, 5 to 10% is probable, but it could be even more than that. Why would this be a problem? Well, it could be a problem for inflation. Europe is a continent generally that imports a lot of foodstuffs, etc., and energy from other parts of the world. If the value of the currency declines, especially if it declines steeply, then we're going to find a situation where things just become more expensive for the consumer, and that would be negative for the Portuguese consumer as well as for consumers elsewhere in the EU. In a similar vein, for Portuguese people who maybe want to vacation abroad, if they wanted to go, for example, to the UK or US or other parts of the world, they would find that their tourist euro didn't go as far as it used to simply because of the devaluation of the currency. The flip side of this, of course, is that as the euro becomes less valuable, it makes exports more competitive. But I think the question for Portugal there would be, is it a kind of high value export driven economy? And the answer to that is no, not really. It's a service-based economy. A lot of things like tourism and hospitality here, a little bit of agriculture, etc., but not really very much industry and not a lot of high value exports. So I don't think that Portugal is really in pole position to benefit from a decline in the euro value, and it will probably be a negative for the country. Lastly, defence spending. Now, we know that Donald Trump is not very happy with NATO as it is currently constituted, particularly because many NATO member countries don't spend enough on defence. In 2006, all NATO member states made the commitment to spend at least 2% of GDP on defence, but only about half of them have actually kept this commitment, even after years and years of it being raised as a problem, and the previous 4 years of the Trump administration from 2017 to 2021. So yeah, unfortunately Portugal is one of those countries. It's supposed to spend 2% of GDP on defence, but currently only spends 1.55%. So Portugal would need to find approximately another 1.5 billion euros per year to spend on defence in order to satisfy the minimum requirements of this NATO agreement. Trump is not famed for being the most patient person, and he has made threats like the US will withdraw from NATO or it won't honour its NATO commitments to member countries who do not spend enough on their own defence. So I think that this puts Portugal in a rather precarious situation. Obviously they're underspending, there's no denying that, and they're going to need to step up their spending on defence in order to come into conformity with what Portugal itself has agreed basically over a decade and a half ago, and yet still hasn't done. So there you go, that brings us to the end of this video and my list of some positive and negative things about Donald Trump coming to power in the US from the perspective of Portugal. Please let me know what you think in the comments below, and if you have any other suggestions, I would of course be thrilled to hear them. So that'll do it for this video, and I will see you soon in the next one.